Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today in this wonderful place, in this impressive company. I hope I can add something to your enjoyment of this occasion. In spite of the fact that I'm an economist, I'd like to talk about creativity. Economists have long paid lip service to the idea that innovation is a primary source of economic growth, yet economics has no theory of innovation and very little to say about it at all. One reason for this is obvious. Innovations are made by individuals, and in general, economists do not believe in studying individuals. For the past decade, I've been doing research that violates this taboo, and I've come here today to report some surprises in what I've found. Let me begin with a movie director, a sculptor, and a novelist. Clint Eastwood won an Academy Award as Best Director in 1993 for the movie Unforgiven, which he made at the age of 62. 12 years later, at 74, he won a second Oscar as Best Director for $1 Million Baby. Now, at the age of 77, Eastwood may have made his best movie yet. The New York Times described Letters from Iwo Jima as close to perfect and described it as utterly original, even radical in its methods and insights. Remarkably, the Times described Eastwood as the greatest living American filmmaker. Later this year, the sculptor Louise Bourgeois, who is 96 years old, will be honored with a retrospective exhibition at London's Tate Modern Museum. Last fall, a sculpture Bourgeois made at the age of 88 was sold at auction for just over $4 million, one of the highest prices ever paid for the work of a living sculptor. The great value of a work of this vintage is not an accident, for a recent survey of art history textbooks revealed that it is the sculptures that Bourgeois has made since the age of 80 that art scholars consider her most important. J.M. Coetzee was the first author to be awarded the Booker Prize twice, the first time for the Life and Times of Michael Kay, which he wrote at the age of 43, the second time for Disgrace, which he wrote at 59. Coetzee was subsequently awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Eastwood, Bourgeois, and Coetzee are all late bloomers. Eastwood was a successful actor in his 30s, but he did not direct his first film until after 40. Bourgeois has made art all her adult life, but as late as her early 50s, she was working as a school teacher in Great Neck, New York. Coetzee did not begin writing fiction until he was past the age of 30, and he recently reflected that, quote, "I'm not sure this was wholly a bad thing. How many men in their 20s write novels worth reading?" Eastwood, Bourgeois, and Coetzee are usually considered rare anomalies, isolated cases of artists who remain creative in old age. Yet their cases are neither rare nor anomalous. In fact, they're examples of a pattern which has produced much of the greatest art of our civilization. That this is not generally recognized is powerful evidence that our society lacks a key concept involving the association between experience and innovation. Moreover, I believe that the failure to recognize this concept may be very costly for creativity in our society in general. Since the Renaissance, there has been a widespread assumption that great creativity is the special domain of youth. The word genius, which derives from the Greek word for birth, has been associated primarily with artists and scholars who make sudden, dramatic creations or discoveries at an early age. Recent research confirms that this is, of course, a major source of creativity. Rimbaud, Picasso, T.S. Eliot, Hemingway, Orson Welles, Jean-Luc Godard, Damien Hirst, many other precocious young artists have obviously had an enormous impact on our modern art and literature. The same research, however, has also shown that there is another, very different life cycle of creativity, associated with artists who develop their skills gradually over long periods and arrive at major innovations late in their lives. Cézanne, Dostoevsky, Robert Frost, Mondrian, Jackson Pollock, Frank Lloyd Wright, Francis Bacon are among the modern figures who have made important innovations late in their lives after decades of painstaking effort. And this pattern of increasing creativity with age is definitely not new in the modern era. Titian, Velázquez, Rembrandt, Hals, Goya are just a few of the artists who achieved their greatest contributions late in their long lives. These two patterns of creativity over the life cycle do not occur by chance, but are the product of two very different types of innovator. These two types differ in their goals, their methods, and the nature of their contributions. I call the young geniuses conceptual innovators. Their goal is to express an idea or an emotion. They plan their work carefully in advance, and they can consequently execute it systematically and decisively. Their innovations appear suddenly, as a new idea produces a result not only very different from other artists' work, but also from their own previous work. In contrast, I call the old masters experimental innovators because they work by trial and error. Their goal is very different. It's to record their perceptions. They're uncertain how to do this, so they proceed cautiously and incrementally. Their innovations consequently appear gradually over long periods. They are not declared in a single work, but emerge piecemeal in a large body of work. Their uncertainty about their goals means that they are usually unsure of their progress, and even the greatest of experimental innovators typically express frustration at their inability to achieve their elusive goals. Paul Cézanne was an archetypal experimental innovator. His art was a lifelong quest to achieve a visual goal that he could never describe precisely. He made scores of paintings of his beloved Mont Saint-Victoire over the course of the last 3 decades of his life, gradually changing its treatment to arrive at the magnificent late works that would inspire every major artist of the next generation. Late in his life, he wrote to his friend and dealer Ambroise Vollard of his doubt. "I have made some progress. Why so late and with such difficulty? Is art really a priesthood that demands the pure in heart who must belong to it entirely?" Less than a year after Cézanne's death, the young Pablo Picasso produced a revolutionary masterpiece that would transform the art of the 20th century. After making more than 400 preparatory paintings and drawings, the largest body of preparatory work for a single picture in the entire history of Western art, the 26-year-old Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the shocking work that announced the beginning of Cubism and thus became the most important painting of the modern era. Although Picasso's dramatic innovation was based on Cézanne's achievement, it was created not by observation, but by thought, as the symbolic language of Cubism broke decisively with the Western tradition that a painting would imitate the appearance of its subject. Mindful that Cézanne had portrayed the true artist as a seeker, the revolutionary, iconoclastic young Picasso was at pains to stress that, quote, "When I paint, my object is to show what I have found, not what I'm looking for." Cézanne painted to learn. Late in his life, he told a younger artist, "I seek in painting." Picasso painted to express himself. He explained, "I don't seek, I find." Cézanne and Picasso are prime examples of the two types of innovator, but they are by no means unique in their behavior. Conceptual painters from Masaccio, Raphael, Holbein, Vermeer, to Seurat, Matisse, beyond, to Andy Warhol and Damien Hirst, have planned their paintings meticulously in advance, so meticulously, in the cases of Raphael, Warhol, and Hirst, that they can have others actually execute the paintings. Whereas experimental painters, from Titian, Leonardo, Rembrandt, Velázquez, to Monet, Cézanne, Pollock, Bacon, Lucian Freud, have been unable and unwilling to plan their paintings, believing that the essence of creativity lies in the process of making the works, and so also in the other arts. So, for example, the conceptual James Joyce could outline Ulysses as a whole before he began to write it, and consequently did not have to write the chapters in their final order. In contrast, the experimental Virginia Woolf confessed that all her attempts to plan her novels soon had to be abandoned. She wrote that her novels grew day by day, week by week, without any plan at all. The experimental Coetzee explained that planning his novels is out of the question because writing is a process of discovery. As he put it, you write because you do not know what you want to say. What writing reveals may be quite different from what you thought you wanted to say in the first place. In every activity I have studied, there are two very different kinds of innovation. They're made in very different ways by people with very different kinds of talent. The talent of conceptual innovators is for abstraction. They have an ability to simplify problems. In contrast, the talent of experimental innovators is for the real and the concrete. They have an ability to accumulate evidence and to solve complex problems with knowledge gained from their experience. Rather than the sudden flashes of insight with which the conceptual innovators solve their problems, experimental innovators gradually accumulate the wisdom and judgment that they use to approach their less clearly perceived goals. Conceptual innovators in the arts are recognized and rewarded early in their lives, and this helps them to pursue their work. Experimental innovators, however, are often overlooked until they are considerably older, for they lack the facility and precocity of their conceptual counterparts. This neglect obviously prevents some from developing their art. Cézanne, the son of a banker, had independent means that allowed him to work at his art even though he gained little income from it. Others are less fortunate and have to take jobs that leave them little time to develop their art. Worse still, many become discouraged at the lack of interest in their art and give it up altogether. How many Cézannes or Virginia Woolfs are we losing? There's no way of knowing. But in the arts today, there is tremendous pressure for rapid and dramatic innovation, and this gives a great advantage to conceptual young geniuses. The resulting loss is not only to the careers of the individual experimental artists, but to the very nature of our art. For today's art privileges facility and simplicity, ideas at the expense of depth and complexity of visual content. And the problem is even more severe. By now, you've probably realized that this analysis is not unique to the arts. My initial discovery of the two life cycles of creativity was made by studying painters, and then I explored the generality of these patterns by studying important practitioners of a series of other arts: poets, novelists, sculptors, movie directors, architects, playwrights, even popular songwriters. In case you're curious, Cole Porter was experimental, Lennon and McCartney were conceptual. And let me point out that this analysis is clearly relevant also to social entrepreneurship. The late Michael Young, who's been spoken of several times already today, was perhaps the world's most prolific social entrepreneur, was an archetypal experimental innovator. He had the basic uncertainty of the experimentalist, as he once declared that, "I have never had an idea that I was sure about." As a result, in all his activities, he proceeded cautiously. In the introduction to his doctoral thesis, he compared his scholarly method to the experience of finding his way through the dense London fog that had enveloped him on his first visit to the East End community that became the subject of that thesis. He wrote, "I felt my way along, tapping my foot against the curbstones as I went. I am still tapping." Yet his uncertainty never prevented him from making an effort to achieve what he understood to be the best option, no matter how much opposition he encountered. He attributed his accomplishments to a combination of perseverance and bloody-mindedness. Above all, however, he reserved the right to change his mind as he went, for his tapping in the dark was not aimed merely at moving, but rather at making progress. In 1998, at the opening of his School for Social Entrepreneurs, in his inaugural speech, the 83-year-old Lord Young offered a remarkable definition that captured the essential humility and open-mindedness of the experimental innovator as he explained that, quote, "Introducing an innovation is an exercise of entrepreneurship, and for me, entrepreneurship is best thought of as a concentrated and targeted kind of learning. The idea has to be subject to continuous examination, a continuous trial and error." Appropriately, Young made that speech in Bethnal Green, where decades earlier he had learned about the problems facing the English working class by talking to the people who lived there. Over time, Young had become more and more deeply engaged with these problems, for as his friend and biographer Asa Briggs remarked of Young, he was a traveler who becomes increasingly involved the longer he continues his journey. Nor should Young's experimental orientation be considered in any way surprising, for the complex problems faced by social entrepreneurs can often be expected to require perseverance and bloody-mindedness in the face of both external opposition and internal uncertainty. And perhaps the key is Michael Young's emphasis on entrepreneurship as learning, not with a fixed goal, but as an open-ended process with continuous examination and constant trial and error. Michael Young was a successful scholar, but Asa Briggs noted that he was never completely comfortable in a university setting, for he needed to be in the field, learning about the problems he wanted to solve. Michael Young would certainly have agreed with the metaphor of another important social entrepreneur, Muhammad Yunus, that the university classroom was like a beautiful movie theater, quote, where professors have all the answers and the tale works out so neatly at the end of the day. But it's make-believe. When you turn the lights on and go outside, it's a completely different world. Frustrated by the failure of economic theory to help solve the problems of the rural poor during a famine in Bangladesh in 1974, Yunus decided to learn about the poor at first hand by going into their villages, and in his book, Banker to the Poor, he tells us that it was there that, quote, the poor taught me an entirely new economics. In classic experimental terms, Yunus tells us that when he first began lending money to the poor, quote, I did not know if I was right. I had no idea what I was getting into. I was walking blind and learning as I went. Yunus founded the Grameen Bank on the basic principle that experience is the best guide. All the bank's employees are encouraged to suggest changes in even the most basic rules if they perceive better procedures for dealing with the problems they encounter in the course of their daily work. Social entrepreneurs do not all have to be experimental. Most disciplines, both artistic and scholarly, thrive on the combination of the two approaches and the creative tension between theoretical and empirical innovation. But as in other disciplines, it is the experimentalists who are likely to have the harder time finding their way. Solving this problem is difficult, for providing a completely level playing field would require the creation of new mechanisms to recognize and record incremental research, discipline by discipline. Yet, the difficulty of solving this problem is not a reason to ignore it, and in fact, recognizing its existence may be an important step in the direction of solving it. For many experimental thinkers in the arts, in scholarship, or in business may be encouraged simply by knowing how common the phenomenon of painstaking and gradual seeking actually is, and also by knowing how often this has led to valuable outcomes. Wisdom may be a less conspicuous trait than the brilliance of young conceptual innovators, but it will always have a role to play in providing the judgment either to offset or to complement the abstract ideas of the theorists. Experimental practitioners of all disciplines can be encouraged by the success of such great experimental artists as Clint Eastwood, Louise Bourgeois, J.M. Coetzee, and of such great experimental entrepreneurs as Michael Young and Muhammad Yunus, and should draw inspiration from their persistence. As Bourgeois told an interviewer in 1993, I am a long-distance runner. It takes me years and years and years to produce what I do. Thank you very much.